so we can go ahead and make the most of our time, I'm going to turn things right over to Rick Mayer to kick things off. Rick?
Thank you so much, Brian. And thanks to everybody. I know I see some of these names are familiar ones that were with us on our last webinar this afternoon, so I appreciate you folks for running through the tape, as it were, with us here today, and for attending the second of our special events under the Institute specialized tracks. Today's webinar is part of the Reemployment Connections Institute, and it's affectionately titled the IWR WIPP 101 webinar. And as that title suggests, today is about giving all of you as members of the teams working in implementation states the opportunity of understanding at a higher level at least the features, the benefits, the outcomes of pilot states that have taken it on themselves to implement either or both of what I have now started to call the ITSE tools, right? These tools that have been designed to kind of overlay existing state systems and allow you to have an integrated workforce registration, that single portal, and a profile page to serve the job seeker as they move through to try to engage with our system and engage importantly with reemployment services again, using virtual tool sets. What I want to do is to kind of just lay out the way that we're going to do this here quickly with you and introduce our panel today. As I said in our session yesterday, I think among the most valuable parts of the Institute is our ability to put you guys in touch with folks that have done this before and have earned the stripes and have learned the lessons of being the first to try to do something new and exciting. And as a result, they can tell you what they've learned, what to do, what not to do, and give you the benefit of their lessons learned and shortcuts. And the way we'll do this is we have about 90 minutes planned for this session today. We'll take up to that amount of time. We have 3 presenters here, and I'm introducing in a moment. What I'll ask you to do as state team members, if you would, as you're listening to our presenters, we have a hefty question and answer period scheduled at the back end of this. And if you would raise your questions through the chat window, if you type in questions as they occur to you through the chat window, if our presenters see them and they address them during the presentation, it's fine. If not, I'm going to queue them up kind of behind the curtain and use them to drive a really robust conversation and to get your questions answered during the Q&A. So let me acknowledge the fact that we have a really full kind of virtual room here today with a lot of states having attended, and I really appreciate you guys being here. We have 3 really qualified subject matter experts on the subject of the IWR and the WIPP tools, and we also have a team, including Jen Pirtle at ETA, that are with us and in attendance this afternoon. So if there are questions during the Q&A that are more appropriately dealt with by ETA, we have them with us as well, and so I want to acknowledge and appreciate them being here. So if that kind of sets the tone for this introductory event, then let me, if I could, just take a minute and introduce our panel to you, the folks that will be sharing with you some of what they know about the integrated workforce registration and the individual profile page. And first, most of you know Tom Krasnarek. Tom's been in IT and in our system for quite a while. He's a fellow native of New Jersey, but don't hold him against that. He's now with ITSE and the assistant technology director at ITSE. And Tom has been working from the outset on the construction of these tools and the development of these tools, and I know he'll have important information to share with you. Tom is joined by Melissa DeAndres, and Melissa is with the New York State Department of Labor. Again, New York has been a pilot for many of the, not all, I guess, of the transformational elements, if you will, of the original vision. So, Melissa, we're happy to have you here. And then we have, finally, Mohammed Jalal Laludin from Mississippi. And Mississippi has done a great job integrating these tools already. I was privileged to have seen their presentation in Denver, and at the NASWA conference, and I'm so happy, Mohammed, that you're with us today, and I know people are going to get a lot out of seeing what you all have been able to do with the tools down in Mississippi. So I'm going to go ahead here and turn this over to Tom. As I do that, let me mention for the room that Tom is traveling, and so, Tom, we do appreciate you kind of fighting through the storm to be with us today. However, Tom is on the phone line and does not have an internet connection, so I'm going to be his Vanna White. And, Tom, if you'll just call out when you need me to advance a slide, I will do that for you, my friend. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom Krasnarek.
So, good afternoon, everybody. How are you? I wanted to start off and just kind of talk about some of the foundation that the four transformational elements came from. And that is the national work group that was actually developed by the state, federal, and local leadership throughout the country. And you know, I know each of you have probably seen bits and pieces of this document or the vision document, but it's really something to keep in the front of your mind. And it's not just that the document maps out these four transformational elements, but it also sets a mindset. That is, the mindset is that a UI claimant is a job seeker first. And that's one of the core concepts that we use when developing requirements for these different applications that you're going to hear about in these upcoming slides. As you can see as well, there is, as well as being posted on the Reemployment Connection website, there is a link at the bottom of this PowerPoint so that you can access the vision document and read up on some of the concepts that were behind the pieces that were developed. So in the next slide, Rick, we talk about the Integrated Workforce Registration System. The Integrated Workforce Registration System, or the IWR, which we mostly call it, was built on the concept that we wanted to minimize the data collection between the different workforce agencies. We wanted to build a system that eliminated the multiple times that a job seeker had to provide the same information to each system, as well as also trying to create more synergy between the workforce systems. So by doing this, the pilot states, along with USDOL, came up with the concept of this integrated workforce registration system that basically provides a lot of flexibility to each of the states. Now, granted, the pilot states are representing themselves, but the same concept, and I have to give them all their recognition in this, they always kept in mind that this is going to be not only adopted by their own state, but they kept in mind that this is going to be adopted by a lot of states, or can be used by a lot of states. This was a need across the entire country to be able to start creating a different view on how these state systems actually interacted. So some of the core concepts. So we know that there is common data between each of the state agencies or workforce systems. So we took that and we said, okay, well, right off the bat, the federal common data or the federal reporting could be used as a baseline. So we took those data elements that are collected for reporting purposes, and we started off with that. Those federal data or federal reporting data elements are part of the IWR, along with each individual state, which then mapped out their individual needs of what data elements they currently collect within their system and are passed to different systems in the back end. So the concept of IWRs is go through, create that single entry point or common front door to the workforce agencies, and then pass the job seeker on to the ancillary systems after that. Now, a couple technical things I want to mention here is that this system is actually in the process of finalizing development. It's actually going through testing as we speak. We're in the testing phase of this, and the pilot states are going to be implementing this in early 2014. The other piece I want to mention is that this also provides a common single sign-on solution for the workforce agency as well. As most of you guys may know, or currently your state has, a single sign-on solution reduces the need for these different systems to create multiple user IDs and passwords to access similar services. So what we try to do is try to package that as part of this process, which creates a higher level of security and also more of a synergy across the different systems, so that they only have to remember one user ID and password going forward. So next slide, Rick. In this next slide, I wanted to basically discuss some of the real-time triage components. As part of the core concepts of the pilot project with the pilot states, each of the states kind of took the high-level requirements or the vision and mapped it out on how it applies to their existing states. And they wanted to build requirements, and as part of this project, you've seen some of the use cases and requirements documents that are around that. They took that and mapped that back to how their existing systems currently look at job seekers. And not only within a single siloed system, but across the board. How can we better provide services to the job seeker knowing that we have all this rich data content in the background? So in doing that, they actually mapped out basically these real-time triage components, taking analysis and understanding the different the data elements that they have in the back end and trying to map that back out to recommendations. An individual or a job seeker, and most of the time is our first entry point, is them coming in through the web. So we wanted to be able to provide a richer path for the job seeker to access different services. And as you're going to hear as you go along and you speak with the other pilot states, New York and Mississippi, they used that as a concept when they were actually developing their triage components. Now, triage itself was actually a state individual concept, but each of the states have components that they're actually building in the back end to address it and actually start to integrate that with the different tools that are being provided as part of this project. Next slide. So the next piece is the job seeker. So you see here, the job seeker is more than their last title. We understand right now that there is the path that the states take is mostly using the ONET coding to be able to do job matching in the back end. But that's only using basically, it's based off of an occupation, right? So the states themselves wanted to come up with basically a new approach, or not even necessarily a new approach, but a richer approach in providing out these different job recommendations. We also wanted to provide information to the job seekers so that they understand what their career paths are and how to actually advance in their career path along the way. What skills do they currently have that would actually be used in different job postings or different careers? So understanding this, each of the pilot states wanted to go through, and you'll hear New York actually talk about some of the tools that they're using. It's basically looking at different things such as skills-based job matching and how that could be utilized within their states. They're also going through and looking at different training opportunities that are out there that would actually make the job seeker more attractive to the employment in their area. And doing that is going through and providing better services and also a single location where they can find this information. All of this is going through, and the states are currently piloting different applications to be able to address this. You'll hear Mississippi with their enhancing their wing system, and same with New York with their job zone. But I think overall, what it's going to provide is basically a stronger approach to actually providing job postings out to the job seeker. Next slide, Rick.
Got it.
So the next big piece was, we talked about the 4 transformational elements, the integrated workforce registration, and the real-time triage, and the job match skills transferability. And the one thing that was missing, and the pilot states noticed this very early in the process, is that there was no place to truly send the job seeker after going through this process. How do we really take this data and relate that back to the job seeker so that they have pretty much a hub to communicate with the different workforce agencies? So they came up with the concept of the Workforce Integrated Profile Page. And this profile page was basically a modular approach in communicating or creating a two-way communication between the job seeker and the workforce agency. What it is basically a breakout or a modular breakout to the different workforce agency systems that are currently siloed under the umbrella of the agency. So this allows for the agencies to go through and take those modules and totally customize them based on the information that they feel is appropriate for the job seeker. As you can see here, I'm showing a screenshot of basically some common information that's going to be shared with every job seeker, such as job postings and basically UI claim information. But each of these areas are created highly configurable so that each state can adopt them and customize them to make them their own. The concept along the way was to create a system that was as customizable as possible, allowing flexibility at every avenue, and also allowing the states to also adopt them to enhance them themselves. So throughout the entire process, it's not only taking the information from the pilot states and going through and having to adopt the entire system based on how the pilot states outlined them, but it's really taking the foundation that the pilot states laid out to you, and then moving that even further, sharing your own experiences, enhancing the system so that you can make it your own, but then sharing that back to the pilot states and any other states that are interested for future use, and also allowing other states that are interested to adopt what you may have developed. All of these systems are being implemented in two different ways. And then one of the important things this is another way of creating more of a transferable system to the state agencies. The first implementation approach is taking it and implementing it within your own state. We wanted to provide the flexibility. We know that states have certain guidelines that they have to follow. So adopting the entire system, implementing it within your own state, and hosting it there as well is 100% allowable. We provide an implementation guide, which has been posted out to the Reemployment Connections website. So any questions there, feel free to go out and review that document. We also have a cloud-hosted environment that is available for the states as well. And the cloud-hosted environment is basically a multi-tenant environment that allows the state workforce agencies to share in the operations and maintenance of these systems instead of duplicating the infrastructure and maintenance that they would require to be able to run these different systems. So on that, I know I kind of ran a little short there, Rick, but any questions, feel free to put them in the chat area. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rick.
Oh, Tom, thanks so much. And again, I want to acknowledge from everyone that we appreciate you staying with us. I know you're traveling and it's difficult not being able to connect, but you did a great job laying a foundation, I think, of, kind of where these tools came from the original vision from the state and federal work team down to, ITSE having worked through all the requirements and developed the tools, and then actually pilot states enhancing the vision further by coming up with the idea of the WIPP themselves. So it was a great place for us to start. It gives us a good foundation for us to move forward from. And Tom, as always, I appreciate you helping us get it going. Before I turn the mic over to Melissa from New York State, let me remind you guys that if you have questions on anything you saw from Tom, feel free to pop them into the main chat. I've gotten a couple of them that I've got already queued up, Tom, and we'll come back to you during the Q&A. But right now, I'm going to go to Melissa and give the mic over to you. Melissa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rick, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to just take a moment to reiterate some of what Tom said, in that while the technology that we're using to make this project happen is in the IWR and the WIPP, this project has that bigger goal of at least in New York State, flipping the order that customers receive services from our department, the Department of Labor. It used to be that you were a UI customer first, and as part of receiving UI, you might receive some employment services. Now you are considered a job seeker first and foremost, and one of the services you might receive as a job seeker is unemployment insurance. Data collection is streamlined. The data is shared within the department. In New York State, we've been able to bypass data ownership rules where we weren't allowed to share our UI data with the workforce side. So now that we collect it up front, it belongs to both of us, and we can share it and use it at will. And ultimately, our customers will receive their services faster and better. This new goal is shown in both how we present our tools to the job seekers and how our staff embrace these changes. This has caused changes in our software, in our processes, and ultimately how our staff even think and how they operate. I should have put our slide up to show the objectives that I wanted to cover. You can read for yourself, but to give you a sense of what this project is about. So our ultimate goal in our department is obviously to benefit customers by connecting them to jobs. And in New York, we already had tools, online tools, that helped both job seekers and UI claimants. We have our Job Zone tool, which is similar to the My Skills, My Future, and My Next Move, the federal tools that have a lot of assessments, and you can build your resume, you can do some job searching, you have access to labor market information. And before we even began this project, we started moving the project to connect our Job Zone to our case management system and make it one whole system. And then on the other side of the house, we have our UI application online, obviously. So those were working pretty well, and we were getting customers back to work, and we were helping people, but it wasn't enough, and we decided it was time to look at the customer experience for our clients and bring all those tools together to become one functioning system. This project, the UIS Connectivity Project, is the catalyst to making the user's experience better, our systems more efficient, and our staff more forward-thinking. I'm going to repeat myself a lot. I apologize already for that. Because of this project, we have been able to change the approach of our staff, both business and technical. And instead of having all these independent applications, we've been able to open up the perspective, realize that all our customers are the same, they are all job seekers, and we've been able to see that these different applications would be more useful and work better if we brought them together as a cohesive system. As Tom pointed out in the beginning, our project included both the IWR and WIPP, the real-time triage, the skills transferability, and the social media components. I know that the Reemployment Connections project is a little bit different. And some of the tools that I mentioned before, the Job Zone, is where we are really putting into play the real-time triage and the skills transferability using some of the burning glass tools that most of you are probably familiar with. But today our focus is on the IWR and the WIPP. And as Tom covered, and from a technical standpoint, this project is made up of the three major components: the single login, the single registration, and the common landing page. All of these components are offered as services within what's called the Integrated Workforce Registration System. And you can use them as you see them in the system or in any combination along with solutions that are offered or already exist in your own state systems. And I just want to point out the difference between the IWRS and the IWR. The IWRS is the whole system encompassing the single sign-on, the IWR, and the WIPP, whereas the IWR is just that registration that they most likely will only go through that first time they come to you. And I'll go more into that in a minute. So the single login. Having a single point of entry helps the user in that they feel that it's one system to help them. They become familiar and comfortable with where they are on the internet. They trust our site And it's just simply easier to remember one username and password. To make things easier for the states, you have a choice when thinking about creating this single sign-on. If your state already has one, you can integrate with the other tools and not use the IWRS sign-on. Or if you don't have one, you can use the one that was developed by ITSE. In New York, we already have one, so we're going to be using that and then just connecting to the IWR. So the IWR is the Integrated Workforce Registration, and this is the one piece that truly makes you realize that UIES is here to make our services more accessible to the job seeker. This is the part of the system that stands out as being a lot of work for staff up front during the design of the system, but it will streamline and simplify the user experience. This registration allows for one common place to gather registration or profile information about the job seekers that can then be used by any of your Department of Labor systems or however your agencies are set up in your states. It will require that you spend hours comparing data fields to find the common fields between the systems so that a job seeker could input or update those fields one time in one place and magically have them appear in both their UI accounts and ES accounts and show that updated information. And this is tricky. It's not an easy task because not only do you have to choose the fields, but you have to know the purpose of that question or data, the data sizes, other dependent fields, any logic behind it, the verbiage you want to use, and the permissions for updating between the different systems. And all of this is pretty tricky. For example, in New York, we have a school status question that serves one purpose for the UI system and a different purpose for the AS system. How do you only ask that once, but have it serve both purposes? This piece really needs to be handled carefully and in detail, and prepare to spend a lot of time analyzing the fields. After a user inputs their initial information into their profile, this new UIS system should update both your UI and ES databases. Obviously, this will not only save the user from duplicate data entry, but it gives your system better data integrity. And not only that, but your staff can start providing services directly to the customer instead of wasting time on data collection. Moving on to the WIPP, the Workforce Integrated Profile page. If your state already has a common landing page, then you would want to make sure that this is integrated with both your UI and employment systems, and the single sign-on. But if one doesn't already exist, you could use this WIPP available in the IWRS for those states that wish to use it. The common thought for this page is that it's just a home for the job seeker, the person logging in. It gives access and entrance to both UI and ES and potentially other services within your agencies. It should have a dashboard feel, but you're keeping the functionality in the current systems. This simplifies the whole system as well as the user experience. You don't want to duplicate what those systems do on the WIPP. The dashboard is just a jumping off point to those other services. You don't actually use them on the WIPP for the most part. For example, we will have job matching on the WIPP, but then if you wanted to do any further job matching, you would go to the application that provides that. In New York State, that's in Job Zone. So, that's where you'll have access to, in New York, your Job Zone, our Burning Glass tools, and the UI application. The WIPP should also allow for the triage and logic so that you can personalize and really customize the page for the user. You can give them links to areas in your system that will benefit to their specific situation. For example, you wouldn't give them a link to certify for UI benefits if they don't even have a UI claim open, or only give veterans links to veteran information. If you can allow for even more personalization and using logic, you could see what's missing from their profile, maybe something they didn't answer, give suggestions or guidance about we, the experts, feel would be a good next step in their job search. And I think that Mississippi will be focusing in more detail about the WIPP. I'm going to read a question that came up about doing the labor exchange in the WIPP, but then continuing into Job Zone, and that this sounds like it becomes a front end to Job Zone, and it is. I just always picture when you log into your credit card account or your bank account, from that home login page, then you can go to check your balance or to pay a bill or do multiple different things. And that's what I always think of as the WIPP. It's just what you land on when you first log in, and from there it's a diving board to all the other things that you want to do. But it's personalized and customized to you in your current situation. A few other thoughts about the WIPP and what you should keep in mind when designing it is, don't duplicate, one more slide over, your current systems. I already kind of covered that. Don't overwhelm the job seekers. Keep it simple, keep it clean. It's a diving board, a jumping off point. Give guidance where you can and just kind of move them in the right direction, move them to their next step without overwhelming them, and use the tools and navigation that is standard on most websites and industry standards. So really this whole project is about creating a better experience for your customers by bringing all of the systems together. And we do this by using single sign-on, a one registration, one landing page. And it does take a lot of background work to analyze and push and squish and rearrange your existing systems to do this, but it's definitely worth it. It is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, and you won't have your perfectly envisioned system on the first release, but it's a great first step towards bringing our systems into the future. You really need to know your systems, the flow of data, what's possible, how much change you're willing to do on your existing systems. But I think it's necessary and it's important, and we should all move in this direction. I'm going to just glance at the questions.
I think, Melissa, we can tackle the rest of them as part of the open Q&A. You did a great job picking up that last one. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and I will pass it back to you, Rick.
Okay. Thanks so much. Melissa did a great job kind of giving us some insight into the experience that you had and continue to have in New York State. I mean, New York is such a big place and a complex place, and you guys have undertaken kind of the whole enchilada, if you will, up there. So it's always interesting and important to hear from New York. And remember, to the folks that are listening in, queue up your questions for Melissa and for others. In the chat response, we're bringing questions over, and I've got several of them queued up for our Q&A following hearing from Mohammed in Mississippi. And I really think Mohammed's presentation does a nice job of kind of taking what you heard from Tom and Melissa and kind of giving you some demonstration and view of how it comes together and what it looks like in a web page environment. So, Mohammed, I so appreciate Mississippi and you being involved with us today. I'm going to turn the mic over to you and let you tell us a little bit about the experience of the tools in Mississippi.
Thank you, Rick. I actually want to thank Tom and Melissa for doing an excellent job covering all the major aspects of this project. From Mississippi's standpoint, we have been very lucky in having two modernized systems instead of having multiple silos. We have a single ES system and a single UI system, both modernized. So when we started the National Vision Project, we were very clear on the objectives. Our vision was in alignment with the national vision, with the long-term strategy. So we have been working on a lot of ES UI integration even before we started the Reemployment initiative. As part of that, the first step, we wanted to do along with this project was a single sign-on, which Tom and Melissa both talked about. So we are using the same technology as the IWRS for the single sign-on, but we had to integrate the single sign-on with our UI system and the ES system. So we are halfway there. We implemented the single sign-on within our ES systems. It's operational, and we are working towards the UI system. And once we bring in the IWR system, then all three of them will be able to seamlessly talk between each other. Moving on to common registration, again, Melissa and them have covered all of that, duplication of the data. Again, innovation lets us do more with less. So the single point of entry for the customers is less confusion, more familiarity with the websites. They don't have to deal with multiple logins, multiple systems. It's all single system with single point of entry with a centralized data access. It also helps the CSR control and manage the data in a very seamless fashion. Again, the technology that we are trying to develop here with IWRS and the WIPP is pretty much reusable and can be transferred from one state to another. Again, with a consistent site, users get direct access to reemployment tools in the best strategic location for them to see. Again, this is basically talking about the WIPP page, which becomes the dashboard, which in few slides we will be able to see a sample that we are working on, which is under testing right now. Again, they're talking about the three transformation elements, with the real-time triage, with the single registration, and the skills transferability and job matching. It has a lot of opportunities to help our customers. Most of them are unemployed and seeking reemployment. Next slide. Yeah, in order to prepare, you do need to do a few things, especially like a self-assessment. How integrated are your current systems? A lot of states are still struggling with modernization. They have several silos. For example, you have a trade system, you have a Wagner-Pfizer system, you have a WIA system. So you need to really seriously take a look at what you got and see what's the feasibility and the complexity in order to integrate all of them so that your IWRS and the WIPP can work seamlessly and the interfaces can be made a reality. Right? And then again, how do we manage that change? Who are the key players? Do we have the resources? So those are the questions you really need to ask yourself, and strategize, how you're going to handle that. In Mississippi, when we did, we always build success upon success. We didn't actually expect a perfect product. We wanted to have something first, and then you keep building on top of that. So that's exactly what we are doing. Even before we started working on the IWRS and the WIPP, we started working on the single sign-on. And before the single sign-on, we had several initiatives to integrate UI and ES, especially with automatic ES registration from UI. And most recently, what we did was we did a jobs transfers from the ES system to the UI system, where at the end of claims intake, we are able to show the unemployed claimant available jobs, that they can apply. So that forces them or actually urges them to go to the employment website to get registered. Again, with the national vision, we're going to make this experience even better, where the whole flow will flow from the IWRS into ES registration, and that would flow into the UI. So we are trying to make our customers go through ES registration prior to filing for UI. That way, we will have all the information, such as their job history, their skills, their certifications, their experience, that we can use for job matching, so that the job matching results are more accurate. Again, as I talked about, this building success upon success is an iterative process. You need to plan out in small chunks. That also helps with change management. Next slide. Again, as part of the Mississippi steps, we are implementing the single sign-on using the OpenAM open source software that the IWRS uses the same software as we are using. And again, how do we improve the integration between systems? As I said, in Mississippi, we have only 2 major systems. It is much easier to integrate 2 systems than 4 systems or 6 systems or 7 systems. So it's very important that you strategize, how your systems are talking to each other, so that when you implement the IWRS and you capture the common registration elements, those elements are seamlessly transferred to how many other systems you have in the back end, so that the information keyed once is kept in multiple places, so that we don't ask the customer for the same information again and again, just because we have multiple systems. And we brought in users, for job matching improvements. We did have a brainstorming session with the users who are on the field doing this job on a daily basis. Since we have a modernized system, we had a lot of capabilities already built in, but then we brought the users in to get some feedback as how we can improve this. And the feedback actually helped us a lot in defining the WIPP page. How best can we do the gap analysis, and how best can we take advantage of the experience and the skills and the certification. And again, this helps with LMI data. So we have tons of data with LMI, especially at the county level, at which jobs are in demand, which jobs are going away. What can we do to transition people from one job category to another, which requires similar skills. Right, so that's where the skills transferability piece comes into the picture. Again, we brainstormed a little bit on real-time triage, how between ES and UI you can do a messaging sort of a system for the users, which is, again, part of the WIPP page. So part of the messaging, we came up with, again, a finite number of items, that the system can look for, and then we define a priority on them. So one example is, for example, you have an eligibility review scheduled or an REA assessment scheduled is coming up, so we can show that. Another thing can be a new job that got posted, into a job bank, and that is where the applicant is eligible to apply. So you can show those messages based on a priority, and the system performs real-time triage to determine what the needs are. Another example is it can also determine how long a claimant has been unemployed and what is his status on the unemployment benefits. Is he going to expire his benefits? Is he going to exhaust his benefits soon? Is he going to be out of benefits in near time soon? So the system can detect such things and alert the claimant, or actually force him to look for a job more seriously, or do some intensive services or something like that to escalate the issue. And again, it feeds into a case management process where you can service the claimant, the applicant, more effectively before it's too late. Knocking down silos with an integrated reemployment system, again, for the claimant or the applicant, this creates a very seamless system where they go through IWRS and go through the WIPP, where the WIPP brings in the information from multiple systems. So the user actually is protected from not knowing what's happening behind the scenes. What he sees is all the information from different systems is brought into the dashboard, where he can see the information and take action. Next slide. Again, Mississippi chose to have the IWRS hosted in-house. As we talked about earlier, there are two options with IWRS. You can have it cloud-hosted, or you can have it in-house. Again, it depends on the state's capability. So if you have the capability, you have the infrastructure to host it in-house, you may host it, or you may also outsource it to the cloud. ITSC is working, to provide the cloud services with another vendor. So that's an option which is very good for states who do not want to have that burden of managing or maintaining the IWRS in-house. Mississippi chose to do this because we already have a modernized system, and it is in alignment with our vision, where our systems are together, residing on the same platform, so we really don't have to spend any extra money in order to host IWRS in-house. Whereas with the cloud option, we will have to spend a little bit more money outside of what we already have. Again, it's the registration gateway. The WIPP itself, is something that Mississippi developed in-house. So we are using IWRs developed by ITSC with the help of GCOM. The WIPP also is an option where states could use what ITSC has developed, or states can develop their own. Again, Mississippi chose to do our own because it is part of our modernized system. We didn't want another interface to be built. So we put it in-house because our ES and UI system are already talking to each other so closely that we went ahead and established something called a common database to share the common fields. Again, through this system, you register one time, and you are registered into Agnafizer, WIA, Trade, and UI. Of course, you do have to go through the completion of the registration process in UI and ES so that you are eligible for services. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide, you can see the dashboard. So this is the WIPP that Mississippi developed. As you can see, it is really very, very simple to see and understand. A lot of white space, but a lot of pertinent information. So if you look at the top right-hand corner, it really tells you the activity that has been happening. So you have, for example, one job, viewed today, and then 12, I cannot even read it, applications pending. So, you can apply for jobs. It brings up a default list of job matches based on your skills, your experience, and your education. When employers post jobs, we capture the requirements and we try to match up with the claimant applicant provided information, and we show it. So as we show these things, we can see something called why these jobs, which again I think is covered in the subsequent slides, but I'll go ahead and talk about this now. So this why, when you click on why these jobs, it tells you what we use to match your jobs here that you can see, and you have to some degree you can control what you want to see and what you don't want to see. Again, you can refine it on the top with the search, nail it down to further refinement, and see more accurate matches. On the right-hand side, we can see the messages. Right, so we came up with, say, about up to 6 messages right now. This is something that we already developed. It's in testing phase. We plan to go live in about 2 to 3 more months. So if you look at that, see, did the recent weather disaster affect you? So that's something that we can program. Again, it's optional. All these are very much parameter driven. So we are capturing like a disaster event, and we capture the affected counties and the zip codes, and we detect if the claimant is residing in that location, then we alert. So this is again part of the real-time triage, which says, hey, we see that you live in a location which is affected by the disaster. You may be potentially eligible for disaster assistance or some other assistance. So click here or contact somebody, right, to get further information on this. And this is a work in progress. We, again, as I said, we build success upon success. It may not be perfect. It may not offer you 100% of what you are looking through self-service, but it's there. It encourages the claimant and the applicant to see what we can offer, to see what he will be eligible potentially, and he can seek. So we put him in the right direction. If you click on the see all 6 tips, of course, you will see all the tips or messages. Again, we can customize that, how much we want and what is the priority, so that what should show on this page versus what should show on the detailed link. So next slide. So this is the gap analysis. So what we do is we take the information we have from the claimant, and then we match with the information we have on the job. So we basically match on 3 things: the education, the experience, and the skills. Skills is something, again, is work in progress. This is, something that we think would work in real life, so we are testing it. So we match what skills are needed when a job is posted versus what skills a claimant possesses when we take his resume or when we do his ES registration. Experience obviously simply goes by the occupation code, SOC code, and number of years, and obviously the education is what level of education you have. Are you a graduate? Do you have an associate degree or a bachelor's or a master's, or whatever? So based on that, it matches and it gives you very pictorial depiction, of how much you qualify for. So on the left-hand side, as you can see, is green, pretty much 90% match because you have pretty much a lot of information, 17 out of 20 skills match, and it needs 8 years of experience. You have almost 7, so it uses some algorithm to match it. On the other hand, if you look at the right-hand side, it's something that you pulled up and you are really not a perfect fit, but you may still be interested and you still want to apply. Again, we can't refuse somebody from applying a job. So we not encourage, but again, it's up to the claimant to decide whether he wants to go for it and apply and give it a shot or not. So this helps very visually people to know what they qualify for. They don't have to think a lot. At the same time, on each of these items, you can see there is a link in blue. It says update educational profile, update work history, and update skills. So if you see that, it's showing that I don't have a bachelor's, but I do, actually. That means my information is obsolete. So there is a way for you to go in and update that information. Same way experience. You may have gained some experience and you may not have updated your profile in a long time. So it prompts you to update your work history and your skills and education and all of that. So it's a good reminder for people, why they don't qualify. So this is very apparent, very clear, black and white for applicants to go and fix this. Next slide. Again, we capitalize on LMI data. When you click on the jobs available, we bring up LMI data and show them some basic statistics, which is actually public information. It's very handy for people. They don't have to go search anywhere. It's right here. It tells them the job that they selected, what is the scope for this job, what's the pay range, what's the typical growth rate, or, they can see if this job is going to be high in demand or low in demand or what. So this is very, very powerful data that we offer the claimants, so that they can make the right decisions. Next slide. Again, as part of skills transferability, we do a crosswalk from a primary SOC to maybe secondary, maybe some related fields. So for example, if you have been a sheet metal worker, maybe you have certain skills that match with something else. Right? For example, biomass power plant managers. So this is again just an example, not exactly a right match. So we are trying to build a crosswalk, between a particular SOC code versus what are the related SOC codes that people usually can transition. So if we have a SOC code that is receding, that is going away, and then but people have some skills associated with the SOC code. So with the same skills, what else can they do? So that is the gap analysis, and that's basically it helps with your skills transferability and gap analysis this way. Next slide. Challenges, again, this is a very complex project. As you can see, it takes a toll on everybody. Even though we got the grant and we were allowed to backfill, the reality is we need people with expertise. So we had to pull people with experience, and both technical and business. It's a challenge. We all have full-time jobs, and on top of that, we had to do the extra work. So that's always something you need to keep in mind and plan accordingly. Again, change management is a big deal. A lot of times people who are not used to modernized systems, and when they see these concepts, especially common intake and common registration and all of that, a lot of people have ES and UI viewpoints. It's very difficult for them to come together sometimes. Again, working with multiple states, multiple entities is, again, it's a different ball game that we figured. So we have been working on the national vision for 2 years. We have built a good relationship with ITSC, with New York and us, and we have our own contractors that we work with. So it's a lot of entities to deal with, and it's a challenge. But ITSC has been doing an excellent job of keeping everybody together. So, well, I think that's about it. So as far as Mississippi is concerned, we are trying very hard to go live by February with IWRS, and we are testing right now with ITSC and GCOM and us. And so we are working very hard right now. So, I'm good.
Mohammed, thank you so much. I think that your slides are really important to get people a visual of what, in concept, these tools look like when deployed in a state. And obviously, we saw a version of that in New York. We saw a version of that in Mississippi. And I think it's important to help folks that are on the line today, some of whom are, not yet committed, honestly, to implementing these tools, but they need to have an understanding of what it is you guys have done and how it fits into them. They're forming their future vision for their own state. So I really appreciate your time today, Mohammed, but also all of you as presenters did a wonderful job. And again, if we were sitting in a room in a conference somewhere, we'd all be giving you a big fat round of applause. And I appreciate, too, that you stayed in our time limit. We have something as much as 30 minutes to spend in a Q&A. Now, I've got some questions that have been queued up during the course of this, and heads up to Brian, who's supporting me technically, and also to those of you from the state teams that are in the room with us. I may want to come to one or another state or to open up the phone line. So as we go through this, to just make this more dynamic and allow people to chime in, we may do that. But let me start with some of the queued up questions that I've got, and I'll try to do my best to direct them to one of the three of you as panelists and as subject matter experts. But if you have any of you have a comment on any of these questions, feel free to alert me, and we'll let you, any or all of you, chime in. The first question is this, and I think it's a tough question to start out with, but Gideon was man enough to ask it, so let's get it out. The question is this: I'm interested to know how many work hours it took states to implement the IWR. Now, I know that's a hard guess, but do any of you want to even comment on the level of commitment in hours or dollars of what it's taking you? And I want to state going in, I know these estimates could range wildly from state to state because it depends on how much of this you're implementing and how complex your state systems are today, I'm assuming. But just give us a sense, any of you who care to comment, of what the level of commitment is in terms of work hours or man hours involved in getting involved in this kind of an implementation.
So, Rick, if it's okay, I'll jump in first. This is Tom Kuznarek. The one thing I want to mention with the IWR, we tried to make this as configurable as possible, as mentioned earlier, but the biggest work effort there is not necessarily in the development of the IWR, and although each of the states and the pilot states, and I applaud them both for their participation in, taking the vision and forming it into something a little more real, but the work is integrating your existing systems. So although each of these states may have their own experiences, it's really going to depend on how well your existing systems currently can conform or actually integrate into the IWR, and how it would actually, what effort it will take for your states to actually adopt more of this service-oriented approach in providing information back and forth between the IWR and your existing workforce systems. Right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
So with that understanding, I think one of the biggest things that will actually help you in getting that understanding is taking the architecture document and reviewing some of the current interfaces that were developed for the pilot states, and then moving that and comparing that to your existing systems and what the effort and trying to estimate it based off of that.
Yeah, so for the benefit of the implementation states, I think Tom We generally refer to that document as the technical specifications document. Is that right, Tom?
Yes.
Yeah, and that is on the RC website. It's a product of ITSE. And again, for any state that's going to tackle something like this, one of the first steps and biggest steps required is to get out and understand the requirements of the solution itself and document those. And that technical documentation had already been done by ITSE and their consultants back during that time. Again, part of the commitment ETA made to developing these tools for the system. So a lot of that work is done, and what I'm hearing Tom say is that a given state would probably be best suited to get that document, look at it, have their IT and program folks look at that, compare it to your existing system, and then it might give you a better example of what the likely workload would be in your state than it would, for instance, to compare the hours or bills from a state like New York State or Mississippi. And let me follow up, Tom, because there's a question here from Matt Bruce that I think is closely enough related I want to skip to it. Matt's asking, does every state have to develop their IWR WIPP on their own? Are there common economies of scale to sharing the solutions previously developed? So I think obviously we need to clarify this for Matt, because the answer is no, you don't have to develop it on your own, but you have to figure out how to integrate it to your state on your own. Tom, do you want to take that one, and then I'll ask others if they want to chime in.
Sure. So the IWR, you're not developing this on your own. It's actually something that's acting as that common front door that sits on top of your ancillary systems. The one thing I didn't mention is that this system was never meant to replace any of your existing systems that you may have within your states. But what it's doing is enhancing the capabilities of collecting the data from the job seeker. So it's sitting on top of your existing systems, allowing for that information to be collected, and then passing it down to the ancillary systems, whether it's your ES system or your UI system or any other system that you're attaching to this, and allowing that data to be pushed there. Now with that, this is actually implemented on a state-by-state basis, either in the cloud or in the state. So what does that mean? So that means that you're leveraging some of the work that was already developed by a company that ITSC contracted with, which is GCOM, and using that system, that umbrella, that will sit on top of your existing systems, and then you would integrate with that using something that's called web services. And that allows you to integrate and pass the information back and forth between your systems, no matter what technology basis your existing systems are.
Yeah, so the best way that I've thought of this, Tom, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm a lay person, but I think a lot of the folks from the states at this point are lay people. This thing is kind of an open source wrapper that lays in the internet, in space. It connects using web services to your legacy state systems, right? And you decide what data. And you saw that in New York they integrated their existing job zone application. In Mississippi they integrated things like their labor exchange service, and they integrated labor market information. But each state decides what legacy systems they're going to let display through these open source wrappers, if you will. They're called the Integrated Workforce Registration. And then it depends on how much integration you're going to do and the size and complexity of your systems as to how much that's going to, kind of cost in terms of man hours. Is that fair to say?
I think, yes, you are correct, Rick.
Okay, now, before I move on to related questions, and there are a couple, Mississippi or New York, do you want to chime in on that general question? Again, the tools and your commitments to them and how you took on doing this effort?
Sure. This is Melissa from New York, and I just want to reiterate, the reason that the first pilot states have taken so long is because while we were working on our state projects, we were also designing the national tools. So it's taken us a lot longer. But the bulk of the work will be kind of analyzing your current systems and how you're going to integrate those with these tools. The tools themselves, I like to think of the IWR as kind of a survey monkey. I don't know if anyone's ever used SurveyMonkey to build a survey, but basically it's a framework, and you input the questions that you want to ask. You might have to build a little bit of logic into that, but what we created is a tool to create your IWR. And the WIPP is really also just a shell, a web page, but your state needs to make all the connections for what's going to show on that WIPP and all the logic behind it. What we tried to include were, little windows, little portals, little modules of the information that we thought was important to have on a landing page. But the state is still going to have to actually provide all those services, provide that data, and ultimately provide the application or service behind that to where you will actually go. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense, New York, and I think that's, it's important for folks to know. Mississippi, before we move on, anything else to add about that?
Not really. I think Melissa and Tom covered it all. I think the hard lifting has been done. We, as Melissa said, we worked on the national product, with IWRS and WIPP. We have a framework. We have the shell that helps the other states to simply concentrate on their requirements and on their interfaces as to how they're going to integrate these pieces into their systems. So that's the hard part for each state that they have to go through regardless. But again, half the work I would assume has been done, where the states can capitalize and then just concentrate on their part.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. And then, another kind of non-technical question, but an important one, because we can't assume that folks know all of the jargon from the more technical side of the house. And a question being asked is, if I go with a cloud-based solution, first though, can you help by defining for us what cloud-based means to us lay folks? And then second, do I lose anything by going to the cloud, Tom? Is it still customizable, the WIPP and the IWR? That's the question.
So the cloud itself is actually taking the application and hosting it in a common environment that could be, consumed or integrated with the states itself. The concept behind it was to eliminate some of the duplication in infrastructure, as well as the application stack that would be needed to support the application throughout the different workforce agencies that are interested in it. So it's sharing the cost of the infrastructure, the application, and the hosting by the different state agencies. But the one thing it is it's basically taking a single state implementation and making it more of a multi-state environment. And that is, each state can still have the same functionality that they currently have if it's hosted within their own state. But instead of just them accessing the system, it's actually multiple states hitting that same system. So functionality-wise, it's all still there. But on the technical side, it's more of sharing not only on the cost, but the overall operations and maintenance costs as well. So it's not the hardware itself; it's the full stack.
Yep. So the answer then, guys, is, and to translate is, hosting. When people talk about hosting, you can either host it on a server in your state, and that's what Mississippi mentioned they had decided to do because they already had the facilities. It was no additional cost to them. Or you can host it with a third party, and they mentioned, ITSE mentioned that they're working to develop that capability for states so that you don't have to be concerned with maintaining the servers in your state or the cost of maintaining the software. That's going to be done outside your state, but the functionality of the tools does not change. They're still customizable. Someone else asked the question, and ETA was quick to the draw to answer. These tools are, quote, free, meaning they have been developed by ITSE and their contractors. They mentioned the name GCOM to you. The tools are actually available. They were funded in their development by ETA, and they are therefore open source and available to any state. So your commitment is to integrate them, but not to have to pay for the tools themselves. They're available to you by ETA's investment with ITSE? So that was another question. I think we've answered that. If not,
Yes,
you guys
and
to me.
If I could just add on to that, Rick.
Sure.
We took the concept of open source and used that wherever possible. And the tools themselves are 100% free. The one thing I will kind of add a caveat there is if there is any maintenance or support that goes along with the tools that you wanted, there is the capabilities of having that through the vendors. And we had the list of vendors that were used that provide that. If your states aren't comfortable, and I know we've talked about that with even the pilot states on if they wanted additional maintenance or support from these vendors, although there is from the original development vendor services that they provide. But overall, the entire system was developed using the open source technology so that we weren't bound either by proprietary licenses or by proprietary software that would then require additional licensing costs if we wanted to transfer it from one state to another.
Okay, good. And I hope that's clear enough to folks. And again, I'll use this opportunity to say, remember, this is the first of a series of events under the Institute's IWR and WIPP track, Technology Tools track. And following this, there are, I think, 2 or 3 open chats where they're designed to be full-flowing discussions and kind of open line talks between you and these experts. So I would encourage you guys that have started to develop some understanding today and have questions that, we're going to keep going here for a while, but any questions we miss or questions that come to you after today, that's what those chat sessions are about. And I've been saying it from the beginning, and I'm going to keep saying it until I'm proven wrong. I really think the best thing we can do is to get you access to folks like you're talking to here today and let you kind of have at it and open dialogue, because obviously there's a wealth of knowledge here. And, the shortest distance between your understanding and getting the answers you need is getting you access to these folks. Melissa points out, too, she sent me a little note on the side, to remember to point out that there is a monthly cost for cloud hosting. And I will refer you back to Mohammed's comments. They already had the servers, they had the capacity at their state, so there was no additional cost to them. Therefore, they decided to bring the tools into Mississippi, host them locally inside the state. But if you didn't have that capacity, you'd either have to go out and build your own capacity, or you could buy it, if you will, in the cloud. And when you do, there is a monthly cost to it. But generally speaking, and the whole idea behind cloud services, they're generally speaking somewhat cheaper than it would be for you to develop it on your own, because, as Tom pointed out, multiple states are sharing in the cost of that. So, again, each state, as Mississippi pointed out, needs to make that selection and that choice, and ITSE and others would be available to help you as you go along. I want to shift gears a little bit from the technical hardware kinds of questions to software in a more organizational development use of that term. And Mohammed, I want to come to you for a minute. You made and I'm going to follow up with you, Melissa, too. Each of you spoke in your own words about the level of commitment to making the decision. Melissa, you spent some time talking about the painstaking work you did, and I mean that in a good way, in understanding the data fields and how to best use data that would serve multiple systems. Mohammed, you spoke a lot about the change management aspect and how important that is. I want to ask you, and I'll start with Mohammed and then Melissa, come to you. Obviously, for you to get involved in this, you had to have a few people involved and at the table, right? You had to have leadership from a variety of silos, I'd imagine, and you had to make them want to make this happen. Who did you have at the table involved in making that commitment to go forward with this activity? What are the kinds of people, if I'm in a state considering this, I need to have around the table to get that commitment?
We actually had the support from the highest level, starting with our executive director. Then we went through our local workforce areas, those directors. We went to we have 4 local office 4 WIA areas. We went to each of them, and then we got written commitments from them for implementing the national vision. Actually, it was one of the requirements for us to submit the SBR. So ever since, we have these people involved in everything we do. We have so to speak, the ES director. We have a different title here, but the ES director, and then we have a grant management director, and also the SWIP board members, the directors of the SWIP boards. So we had everybody's commitment, when we did the project, and every now and then we would invite them for brainstorming sessions. We actually had more than few brainstorming sessions starting early this year. So it's been already a year, since we talked to them. It's been an ongoing conversation, and then we also have a excellent vendor in MSPARC, which is our Mississippi State University people, who actually built our modern system, so they knew ES in and out. And also we had people using the new system for some time, so they were accustomed to modernized system, to the internet, and to the browser-based applications, so they were not actually that adverse to change when they realized that it's only going to help them. So it was very interesting that, when we call in those people, how much they will talk to you and to tell you what doesn't work instead of telling us what does work. So we had everybody's involvement. Even the UI director, has been involved throughout when we started writing the SBR. And again, it starts from the highest level.
And Mohammed, I thank you for that answer. And Melissa, I want to come to you real quickly and then make a follow-up point on this. Do you have anything to add to what Mohammed just said?
Sure. In New York State, we were really lucky because our Deputy Commissioner for Workforce, Karen Coleman, was on the original committee that came up with the vision. So we also had buy-in from our top levels right from the start. But we did have to bring, our UI partners to the table, NIT to the table, and there was a little bit of convincing that had to be done. But for the most part, everyone saw the benefits and was on board for making this happen.
And thanks for that. And I do recall Karen involved, and she was very actively involved, and passionately so. And I imagine that did make you, quote, lucky, if you will. But still, I know there's a lot of work at the front end done, and I mentioned that, and I appreciate your guys' insight there, and do so to remind the implementation states how important it is to have that full, robust team, and it's part of why it was in, I think, the composition of your teams is a part of ETA's guidance from the beginning of this process for the Reemployment Connections thing. Whether or not you're going to do the tools today, my advice to you, the more you can get these folks engaged at the beginning, have them understand this vision, whether or not you're doing it this month or later this year or next year, the better off it's going to be to have them be partners in this process and to make them what I call stockholders rather than stakeholders. That let them be owners of your commitment from the beginning. It will pay you long dividends when the time comes down the road, and I'm sure all our pilot states would agree with that. I've got a question from the audience about burning glass I want to get to, but I need to get back just for a minute to Mohammed on your brainstorming sessions. I was really impressed with the way you all chose to use your color-coded, worker, education, the cap and gown image, to show me as a seeker, how close I was maybe to a match or how far away my educational or skill history might be from being able to be qualified for a job. And I think that you guys did a lot of work with case managers and with experts from the One Stop to really define the way you were going to use that WIPP profile page and the way that you were going to kind of flow persons through a self-service platform. Can you speak just a minute to how you engaged people that are actually doing the job and the design of how you integrated these tools in Mississippi?
Yes, actually, when we started talking to those people on job matching, we asked them how we can improve job matching. So we started collecting all the inputs, and we created a document on all the aspects of job matching and skills transferability and the gap analysis. So we tried to understand what they were doing manually and with the existing system, what were the limitations. And of course, we had, as I said, excellent partner in MSU, our NSPARC people. They being a research institute, they had access to a lot of resources and a lot of intellectual people, creative people rather. They understood the requirement and actually came up with this model. It's not just MDES. MDES did provide the input to them, but it was actually a brainchild of NSPARC, who came up with this excellent depiction, the visually appealing, where we can understand and see up front, whether it's a match or not a match. So it's all credit to them, really. From our side, we provided all the input they needed. It goes back to more or less a traditional requirements gathering session. You talk to the stakeholders and you get the requirements, but understanding the requirements is the key to it. So I believe the NSPARC understood the requirement, and they have been in this business for a long time. They are being a research institute. They had access to a lot of other data, and they had a fairly good understanding of the business where they could put something together like this. So again, it's a team effort, definitely, and more credit actually to NSPARC than MDES, honestly speaking.
Yeah, and it's important. In your case, you were designing that from the ground floor up. In New York's case, there are some excellent tools I know already, Melissa, that you guys have. I'm familiar with JobZone from the time I think you brought it to market, because I'm kind of that old, and it's an amazing asset. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about when you made the choice to use the IWR and to start to use these tools and get engaged in this, really transformational activity. I mean, let's face it, you guys are really transforming the way a customer integrates to into our system, and changing the way that they interact with our services and get connected to reemployment services in a real way. So when you did that in New York, you had assets like JobZone that you had already developed. So can you just speak for a minute to the fact that you didn't really have to redo or recreate your assets, right? This was more about integrating what you already had, right?
Right. We were already kind of on this path. And
right.
So we had already begun work integrating our JobZone tool within our one-stop operating system, which is our case management tool, and making that the self-service piece of our case management tool. So that alone was a big step in getting, the data that users were entering online into our case management system so that our staff could access it. As part of that same move, we wanted to replace the job search and resume components of JobZone with the Burning Glass tools that we had already been working with and piloting. And so I know that came up as a question, and that's a thing that New York did separately and is not really included in this project, but we have good things to say about that technology.
Yeah, and thank you. Perfect segue, Melissa. I don't know if you knew you were doing that for me, but you did it. Patrick from Georgia asked the question. He heard the Burning Glass mentioned, but couldn't recall from where. And his question really is, how has the integration gone while working with them? So I'm going to try to touch on this, and you correct me, but in layperson's terms, so Burning Glass is an underlying intelligence, a software tool that states may license to help enhance their labor exchange, their LMI services, and the like. And I know in the case of New York and in some other states, some of whom are on the phone today, if I'm not mistaken, Kentucky, for instance, is using Burning Glass, and I don't know, maybe other states are. But that's kind of independent. So if you're using Burning Glass in your labor exchange processes or otherwise, if you're using it in an application, as an example, behind a JobZone, then you integrate that into the IWR or WIPP. It really, if a state's using Burning Glass, it kind of comes along for the ride here, right? It doesn't really change your approach to integrating the IWR or the WIPP. Is that a fair assessment, or would you change that a little?
Right. And the earlier question that was up talking about integrating with the IWR, there's really not a lot of there's data integration with the IWR, but you're not really doing any services there. That's just an upfront registration data collection piece. So you will probably have to integrate your single sign-on if you have one, and then make that the results of the IWR, the data that's collected there, talk to your current systems. It's the WIPP where you're really doing integration of services, so you can, start your job matching, but then it takes you to where your job matching actually occurs within your own systems. You can initiate your UI claim, but then it's really just a link that takes you to do your UI application. So that the WIPP is where you'll see a lot of the integration pieces.
Awesome. So Patrick, I hope, and Georgia, I hope that answered your question. I believe that it did. Thank you, Patrick, for your answer, and he says you did a good job, Melissa, so thank you. I know that we're coming up to the end of our time together here, and so I believe I've tackled all of the questions, if not all of mine, then all of the ones that came up from our audience, and theirs are a lot more important by a large measure than any I would have. But again, I want to, as we turn to close this session, again, I want to urge those folks from the States, many of whom may not have seen anything like this presentation before about these tools, to remember that this is the first of a series in our technology chats on these technology tools, and that the chats that follow, starting on, I believe, this Thursday afternoon, there'll be a series of chats that get you exposure, increased, informal, dialogue-like exposure to folks like Tom and Melissa and Mohammed. And I can't thank them enough on behalf of ETA for being with us today. These guys all have day jobs too, but they agreed to be pilots, and they have in fact innovated, and now they have knowledge to share, and we appreciate them doing so. And I think all of you in the States are starting to figure out that even within the context of meetings like this, you're innovators too. So I'm going to ask everybody to stay on for a couple minutes. First, I'm going to turn to close to Jen Pirtle at ETA for some closing thoughts, and then I'm going to ask Brian to bring up just a few short, instant answer kind of polling questions so that we can get your feedback about what we did right today and ideas about what we could do better going forward. Thanks again to our presenters, and before you focus your attention on the polls, let me turn it back to Jen Pirtle at ETA for some closing thoughts. Jen?
Yeah, thank you, Rick, and thanks everybody for participating today. I think you now can see the value in having these subject matter experts here to answer your questions and be here to provide their valuable input. And so I would recommend that you, while many of you are logged in separately, I would suggest that you bring your teams together and be on these chats kind of at the same time so that you can have the discussions with your teams while you can ask questions to the subject matter experts, because they may not be available exactly when you are, but you do have this time available to you now, and it is set aside. So I suggest that you meet with your teams when you're participating in these chats moving forward.
Great idea, Jen. And I'll remind folks as we leave, remember, we will be sending a recording to the link to state facilitators. And if you have folks who were not here, your technical staff, your leadership, who you think would benefit from seeing some of what you saw today, remember that resource link is an asset to you, and we invite you to leverage it and use it. There's nothing like seeing the transformational power of these tools as evidenced by New York and Mississippi that I think can open people's eyes to the possibility. And that's what today was about, was to give you the information to do just that. So again, thanks to all of you, to Jen Pirtle at ETA, to Melissa, to Tom, to Mohammed. So much appreciate your involvement, and most important to all of you from the implementation states for your ongoing commitment to this. I will see you on the next event, and I wish you the best of luck. Any further comments or questions, feel free to shoot us an email. We will bring them into the chats to keep them going there. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Thanks for your time today.